Hello and welcome. We're pleased that you joined us for today's session, which is part of our Private Foundations webcast series, Risk Management 101 for Foundations. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Our webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% or 3 of the 4 polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. Polling questions will appear within the slide window. To participate in the polls, please click on your answer and be sure to hit the Submit button to record your response. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry, if you can't download your CPE certificate today, we'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet to receive credit. The attendance sheet is available in our slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit only can be awarded to participants registered as themselves, and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
Before we get started today, I wanted to share our big news that Moss Adams and Baker Tilly have joined forces to redefine accounting, tax, and advisory services for the middle market. Really exciting, and you can read more about it on our website via the link in your console. Now, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Annie Rose Favreau, Director, and Maria Stroth, Senior Manager. Their bios and contact information are located in your console if you would like more information. Now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Annie Rose to get the presentation started. Annie Rose.
Wonderful. Thanks, Danielle, and welcome. Thank you to everyone who's joining us here today. Maria and I are really looking forward to sharing more about risk management within the foundation space. So, as Danielle mentioned, I'm Annie Rose. I'm a director with our team, and I focus on organizational development and governance work for mission-driven organizations, including foundations and nonprofits. And as part of that work, I spend a lot of my time with leadership teams thinking about where are we going in the future, assessing organizational needs and risks, and making plans to help support the resilience of the foundations that I work with. So especially with the board governance work that I do, risk management is a really significant topic that we're pretty much always talking about. So I'm really looking forward to sharing more with you all today. With that, Maria, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Annie Rose. I'm Maria Stroth. I'm a senior manager here, and I specialize in enterprise risk management and all kinds of risk management, really, with mission-driven organizations as well. So that focuses from doing things like enterprise risk assessments to really help organizations identify those different risks that could be impacting their ability to meet their objectives, to things like internal and performance audit, as well as contingency planning. And I'm happy to be here, and thank you all so much for joining. Back to you, Annie Rose.
Wonderful. So today we're going to focus on a couple different areas related to creating the kind of baseline knowledge around what is risk management, how does that and can that work within your organization. So we're going to be talking about risk fundamentals. What do we mean by risk? What do we mean by risk management and how they can apply to the foundations that we work with? We're going to be sharing more tools for you. And so these are tools that basically any foundation can use to help you identify and assess risk and how that fits in with the rest of your operations and your strategy. We're going to be talking a little bit about risk appetite. This is one of my favorite topics, thinking about how do leadership teams conceptualize how much risk they want to take on. And then finally, talking a little bit about how you can bring in risk management practices to your work, because we know that this can look really different depending on things like the size of the organization, the areas of your focus, that type of thing. So we'll talk a little bit at the end here about bringing this into your day-to-day practical world. So that's what we're going to focus on. But before we get into that, we did want to get a sense from the group, from those of you in our virtual room here, about how you would describe your organization's approach to risk management. So we have our first polling question here. We'd love to hear whether this is something where you're already doing a lot of risk management work, or maybe you have some areas of strong risk management, but maybe it's kind of operating in a silo, so sometimes it can be a little disconnected. Maybe you have a couple pieces in place, or maybe you don't yet have anything in this world because you are beginning this process, or maybe you don't even know yet. Maybe this is not a topic that has really come up. Any of these answers is a fantastic answer, and I think we'll have some good pieces no matter where you kind of fall on this spectrum. So we'll give you a few moments here to fill out this polling question. It looks like about 75% of you have been able to submit that at this point in time. So we'll give you a little bit more time. Hopefully we can get a few more of you coming through here. And as always, if you're having any issues with the poll, or if you have any technical difficulties at any point throughout this process, feel free to put that into the chat box, the Q&A box here, so that we can hopefully reach out and help you resolve any of those issues as well. All right, we've got about fantastic. We've got some good results here. And looking down the list, it looks like we have a really great breakout in terms of pretty good representation across these first three pieces. So the spectrum of we've got a lot in place to this is an area that we are in the process of building. So that is fantastic. And then a few more of you down here in terms of we are just beginning maybe the process to defining our approach to risk management, and a couple in the no idea category as well. So that'll be great. I think all of those pieces will probably apply to those two groups. And then I think we'll have some really good actionable items for the rest of you on this list as well. So with that, I do want to make sure that we start off on the same kind of baseline understanding of what do we mean by risk. So I'll hand it over to Maria to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Annie Rose. Okay, so just sort of laying some foundation here about what risk is. We want to think about a few different key characteristics when we're defining risk. We're thinking about uncertainty. So risk involves outcomes that can affect your organization's performance, and that uncertainty can rise from a lot of different factors. So right now, especially, we're thinking about things like market fluctuation. I know regulatory changes are a major uncertainty that folks are dealing with in the foundation space, or operational challenges, which can sort of create ongoing uncertainty depending on where your organization is in your current environment. So lots of things in that uncertainty space that can rise up to be risks for your organization. We're also thinking about impact. So what is the impact of a risk on your organization? What is the level of consequence that it might have? Is it a minor inconvenience, or could it create something like a really significant financial loss or something more impactful to your organization? And then lastly, we're thinking about likelihood. So what is the probability of this risk occurring in your organization based on the current conditions? So something like IT and cybersecurity, the likelihood of that risk occurring may be going up if you don't have the right controls in place in your organization. We know that things like cyber attacks are becoming more common. And so often the likelihood might be going up there in many organizations. But overall, we're thinking about anything that could impact your organization's ability to achieve its goals. And you'll hear that sort of emphasized and highlighted throughout this presentation, because that is really the point and why it really matters to do risk management and to be thinking about risks, is because we want our organization to be able to achieve its goals and stay mission focused. And by having a really good handle on what your risks are and being able to mitigate against them, you're more likely to be able to stay focused on your mission. These are some common risk areas in 2025 that we are seeing with foundations. I won't go through all of them, but want to sort of share them with you here. Reputational risk, so things that could be impacting your foundation's public image or credibility, increasingly important in today's sort of society, with social media and news outlets sort of, sharing messages much more quickly in today's day and age. So reputational risk is incredibly important for foundations to be thinking about. Governance risk, especially for private foundations, making sure we have succession planning in place, that we're thinking about how we're really strategically having a strong governance framework. So that comes up quite often. Financial risk, definitely something really important, especially for community foundations, and especially right now, right? Thinking about things like, how diverse is your revenue portfolio? Are you able to be operationally and organizationally resilient if a major funding source is lost? So that's something that we've been talking to a lot of foundations about, is how to make sure that you have strategies in place to diversify your revenue portfolio and to have contingency planning in place to address and mitigate risks of potential funding loss. So these are some of the common risk areas, like I mentioned, for you all to see on the screen, and we'll kind of dig into some of these a little bit more soon. Okay, we have another polling question that came up really, really quickly. If you could pick only one, which risk area do you think is the most significant for your organization in 2025? So is it impact risk, reputational, operational, governance, financial, or external? I'm really curious to see how this sort of lands with the group, to kind of see what folks are dealing with right now. We've got about half of folks participating, so we'll give everyone a couple more moments to get your responses in.
And I know it can be difficult to pick only one, because so many of these risks are also interrelated with each other as well. So this is a conversation that we often have, where your impact risk and your operational risks, for example, are often deeply interconnected. So I can sympathize with you all, but thank you for going with the format of this question so that we can get a better sense of kind of what's top of mind for folks.
Okay, there we go. Let's see what we have here. Kind of a pretty good split across the board with risks, which is great. Got about 20% of the external risk, and that's definitely something we are seeing increasing for folks, is that external risk category becoming more impactful and more likely for organizations as we're sort of dealing with a lot of uncertainty in the funding situation and market volatility, especially for private foundations, thinking about donors for community foundations and that sort of thing. So not surprising to see that one sort of tick up a little bit above some of the others. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit about enterprise risk management. So we've sort of laid the foundation of what risk generally is, as it relates to sort of uncertainties that could happen in your organization. And we want to talk a little bit about how to manage risk across your organization in these different areas. Enterprise risk management is an organization-wide process meant to help you manage your risks. So it helps you identify all of those different risks that your organization is facing, We talked about those different categories before. There might be even more categories for your organization, or you might even break those categories down a little bit more. So, maybe looking at, governmental compliance versus your internal compliance risks and things like that. But really, ERM is designed to identify all of those potential risks that can impact your organization and help to give you a process to be able to manage them. It's meant to be an ongoing process, meaning that it's meant to be continuous, not sort of a one and done checklist, but rather something that you implement, you do, and you look at on a regular basis, whether that's sort of quarterly or twice a year or annually. Depends on your organization what cadence you might want to implement in terms of reviewing your risks and updating your risk ratings. But it is meant to be an ongoing process to make it as useful as possible for your organization. It's also impacted by people at every level within an organization. So what we mean by that is to have sort of sustainable and meaningful enterprise risk management, you want to have involvement all the way from your board to folks on the front line, your staff who are actually doing the direct work, program management, finance, HR, whatever it might be. And, so having that board oversight into the process in terms of setting the tone, setting the culture about risk management and accountability as well is really, really important. All the way to making sure that staff are aware of potential risks, are thinking about risk in their day-to-day work, because oftentimes staff are the folks who are going to identify risks more quickly than others. And I have a really good example of that actually. Pretty recently, we have been working with a community foundation to help them understand some different risks related to taking in grant dollars and how they then distribute those grant dollars out to the community. And because they have done a lot of work to really train and educate their staff on risks related to grant management, they had a staff person who identified a potentially risky grant application because they sort of had that in the back of their mind. They had had training on things like risk and fraud and what might go wrong, and were able to flag that, and it actually was a fraudulent grant application. And so they were able to sort of identify that risk and keep the organization from moving forward with giving that grantee dollars, and then able to identify that, hey, this is something we should be looking for in the future. So they're able to institutionalize that when they're considering and evaluating grants moving forward. So just sort of a good example to highlight why it's so important to get everyone in your organization involved in and thinking about risk. And then the last thing I want to highlight here is just making sure that it is focused on your organization's objectives. It really is enterprise risk management. To me, that's the most kind of important piece, because it allows you, if you're effectively managing your risks and reducing potential impacts of risk, then you're less likely to be putting out fires, right? And sort of just reacting to the moment. And you're more likely to be able to stay really focused on your mission in the day-to-day, but also when something goes wrong. And so it really allows you to be more proactive and more strategic and really achieve your mission in a more meaningful way. I talked a little bit about this, but just sort of emphasizing, you should care about enterprise risk management because it really supports your organization's success. So funders and donors are increasingly looking for organizations that demonstrate strong governance and effective risk management practices. And so when you showcase a really robust and effective ERM framework, you can start to build confidence in potential supporters, stakeholders, funders, donors in your organization, and that makes them more likely to invest in your mission. And I spoke to this already, but things are constantly changing in the organizations that we're working with. I'm sure in your organization, you're facing sort of constant changes, whether that's operationally with your workforce, in the regulatory environment, in your funding situation. And so having ERM in place can help you on an ongoing basis understand how your risk profile is changing and help you safeguard your resources and make sure that you're resilient over time. And ultimately, like I said, when you are focused on risk management, you're able to focus on program delivery, which is, just so important for all of us in this room. This is a great graphic of the enterprise risk management life cycle. So what does it look like to actually do enterprise risk management? And this sort of, I think, puts it really simply. We want to identify our risks so that we can prioritize them. We want to assess those risks. So thinking about what's driving our risks and what is the impact or the consequence of those risks on our organization if they exist or come to fruition. We want to be thinking about, again, the likelihood of those risks and how prepared are we as an organization to mitigate against those risks. So doing that assessment is step 2. And then, we want to be able to respond and manage those risks. That's the whole point of having a process like this. We identify, we prioritize, we assess, and then we have a way to mitigate risk so that we actually have an impact in making our organizations more resilient. And then monitoring and reporting is the last phase there. And then, of course, it's cyclical. But it's so important to monitor your risks on an ongoing basis because things are changing. And reporting on it on a regular basis to your board, making sure your staff, your teams have access and insight into that reporting is so helpful to make sure that, again, this is top of mind for folks. There's accountability in the process because folks are seeing, have we implemented the mitigation strategies that we've identified? Are we reducing risk to the level that we want to be reducing it to? And Annie Rose will talk a little bit about risk appetite here in a little bit. And so are we aligned with our risk appetite? So those are the types of things that reporting can help us keep tabs on over time and is a really critical component of the ERM life cycle. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a successful ERM framework before we dig into risk management tools. So this is a great slide to just sort of take a snapshot of if you're getting started, if you're in that category of, we haven't really gotten started, but we want to do something with enterprise risk management. Or if you've started doing things, but you maybe haven't institutionalized risk management into your foundation. These are some key things that you can do to get started. And we've helped organizations with these types of things, and it's a really helpful way to get ERM off the ground in your organization in a sustainable way so that it can be continuous and ongoing. First, you'll want to define clear policies and procedures and assign roles and responsibilities. And I just want to say that this doesn't have to be an overwhelming task. So oftentimes folks hear, defining policies and procedures, writing those out, that can be a lot of work. We're not really sure where to start. I would recommend just starting with defining the roles and responsibilities of all the different players. What is the responsibility of the board, the leadership team, managers, staff, and how do we clearly define what their roles are so that each person in the organization understands and knows how to contribute to the success of an ERM program. So that's just a really great start for you, is just let's define those roles and responsibilities. You'll also want to conduct training and build awareness around risk and risk management. So educating staff about the importance of it, educating staff about their roles, which you've defined in your policies and procedures, and really fostering a culture of risk awareness to support employees in identifying and addressing potential risks. And then there are a lot of different simple enterprise risk management and risk management tools that you can implement. We're going to dig into those in the next section, but implementing tools like risk registers and risk assessments can really help you track and manage your risks effectively. And you can adapt these tools, as Annie Rose sort of mentioned earlier on, and we'll talk a little bit about this, to the needs of your organization and to the size and the resources of your organization. So you can have sort of, things like spreadsheets to support your organization, which can be enough, all the way up to, softwares or other more advanced technologies. And then as with any process, you want to review and adjust your ERM framework to make sure it continues to meet your organization's needs over time. Okay. Now we'll talk a little bit about risk management tools. And so we'll get into some different options for you all to start to use if you're trying to identify and prioritize and assess your risks in your foundation. We're going to talk a little bit about enterprise risk assessments. We'll talk about risk registers, and then we'll talk about some program or project specific risk assessments that you all can undertake. And we'll talk about, how these different tools may be useful and in different sort of scenarios that they might be useful. So you can think about what makes the most sense for your organization at any given time. Enterprise risk assessments are meant to be really systematic, holistic, and strategic. So they're meant, again, to look across your entire enterprise, help you identify the full spectrum of vulnerabilities and threats that your organization could encounter. They are meant to be strategic, to inform decision-making processes, and help you prioritize and manage your risks effectively. So basically, with an enterprise risk assessment, you'll go in, identify all the different areas of risk that your organization faces, understand how your organization is managing those risks, how prepared you are to manage those risks, and what you need to do to mitigate risks. I'll show you a quick example here on the next slide. This is just a snapshot, so it's not necessarily every risk that an organization may be facing, but we just wanted to show a little bit of an example of what the results of an enterprise risk assessment might look like. So we've identified the risks for this organization in that far left column, and it shows you which are sort of the highest to the lowest risks. I will say we typically do a 5-point scale instead of the 3-point scale that's shown here for illustration purposes. But a 5-point scale where you have sort of high to low with 5 points really allows you to dig into and understand your priorities in a little bit deeper of a way. So I do recommend that. And the kinds of things that you're assessing in an enterprise risk assessment are the same things we've talked about already in this presentation as we've talked about risk. What is the impact, the likelihood, the preparedness of your organization to address that risk, and what is the trajectory? And what we mean by trajectory is that risk level increasing given current conditions, decreasing, or staying the same? So for example, right now with many of the foundations that we are working with, we're often seeing funding related risk increase as organizations are dealing with trying to increase their revenue diversity, given the various sort of economic, market, and political sort of pressures going on in today's environment. So that might be causing an increased trajectory in that area for folks. And then typically when we do an enterprise risk assessment, we're going to really dig into all of these different areas and include a narrative for each of them to really inform your organization so that you understand why these levels are occurring where they are in terms of impact, likelihood, preparedness, and trajectory. And then identifying risk mitigation strategies, as I mentioned before, to make sure that for each of these areas, especially in these high or more moderate to high risk areas, we understand how do we reduce that risk to make our organization more resilient over time. And then once you've done a risk assessment, you can put that information into a risk register. You can also just start with a risk register, although I'll say it's often helpful to do something like a risk assessment to really identify your risks initially as sort of a foundational exercise. And I should have mentioned with an enterprise risk assessment, it's really good to do that when you are sort of getting started. You know, you want to understand what all of your risks are and how to prioritize and manage those, but maybe you don't have a good sense of what all of those risks are, what those priorities are. So it's a really good tool to help you figure that out foundationally, and something that's good to do every 3 to 5 years. When we look at a risk register, on the other hand, we're thinking about something that is maintained on a more ongoing basis, that is really used to institutionalize that assessment of risk that you've done in an enterprise risk assessment. So risk register is a structured spreadsheet or tool that you use to record and track all of your risks. It has details like the description of each of your risks, its potential impact, the risk owner, as well as mitigation strategies. And it allows for that regular monitoring and management of risks that I've sort of emphasized throughout this conversation so far. It is meant to inform decision-making and, again, being an ongoing tool that you can use over time. And it's as simple as something like this. It truly can be a spreadsheet if that's what your organization has resources and time for. So you can see in this example table, we're looking at the risk category, the risk description so that we understand what we mean by that risk, the rating of the risk, is it high, medium, or low? Who's the risk manager or owner? And again, that's a really key column to have in this table, because when we assign ownership of risks, it just helps improve accountability and make sure we know who owns addressing that risk. And they may not necessarily be responsible for all of the actions or mitigating strategies, but they're responsible for making sure that those mitigating strategies do get implemented and coordinating with others. So that can be a really key, important piece. And it also tracks our current and our planned mitigation efforts so that you can see over time how the risk is being mitigated in your organization. The last thing that I want to say about this is that this is a really great start, and you can take this a step further with having some sort of dashboard or data that you present on a regular basis that summarizes the information that's in your risk register and sort of shows how the risk has changed over time in your organization. The last set of tools before I pass it over to Annie Rose is to talk about program and project risk assessments. So these are risk assessments that you can do when you have a sense of a particular program, a particular risk that you are looking to address. So not necessarily looking sort of enterprise-wide at what are all of our risks and collecting and compiling that information, but maybe looking at a particular area or risk focus. So one of these tools that you can use is an internal or performance audit. So this is a targeted review of processes and procedures to look at specific risks and make sure that they are managed. And so thinking about operational risks, thinking about financial risks, whatever it might be, it can provide an objective evaluation into your internal controls in a particular area. So for example, I did an enterprise risk assessment with a client recently, and they're really struggling with payroll. That was an identification of a high risk area for them. They were concerned about errors in payroll, compliance concerns with payroll. There was a lot of impact that this was having on the organization, even to the point where, because of challenges with the manual processes and errors, they were seeing turnover that was contributed to sort of this mismanagement of payroll that, you know, wasn't intentional, but was just, we just don't have a good process. And we aren't really sure exactly what's going wrong, but we know this is a big problem. And so an internal audit is useful for them, and that's what we're working with them on moving forward, to start to look at what is it in the payroll process that is creating these challenges. How can we make improvements to the process, really dig in a targeted way and try to reduce risk specifically in payroll. So in some ways, the internal audit is a risk mitigation strategy to that larger risk that they're experiencing in their organization. Scenario planning and contingency planning is also really a great tool that we're seeing come up a lot more as folks are dealing with uncertainties like funding challenges, which I've mentioned a few times, and thinking about how do we deal with this uncertainty? What is a way we can manage uncertainty when we really don't know exactly what's going to happen? How do we think about what are all the different possible scenarios and put strong plans in place to say, if this happens this way, here's what we'll do to mitigate that risk and make our organization, again, more resilient. So that's another tool to consider. And then the last one I'll speak about here is due diligence assessments. And these are really, really important for foundations to help assess potential risks of selecting grantees and your partners. So thinking about when you're reviewing grantee applications, having a process in place to assess and understand the risk of that potential grantee. Are they likely to be able to maintain compliance with grant requirements? Is their financial health in such a place that we feel confident supporting them with grant dollars that they will support the mission that we are trying to achieve? And do they have programmatic alignment with our foundation? So these are the kinds of things you might put into a due diligence assessment and create a process to really check the box on these things and whether or not these organizations you're partnering with are meeting those needs for your organization and aren't going to cause any undue risks or harm to your organization. So with that, I'm going to take us to our next polling question and just sort of reflecting on some of those tools that we've talked about in the last several minutes and thinking about what your organization right now might benefit from the most. Would it be an enterprise risk assessment, the development of a risk register to sort of institutionalize that continuous understanding of risk? Is it a program or project specific risk assessment? Do you already know you have a particular pocket in your organization where you really want to dig in and address the risk in that area? Is it all of the above? Or is it you're already using all of these tools? We have about 60% of attendees participating so far, so we'll give you another few moments here, try to get some more participation.
And in the meantime, there's a great question that came through in the Q&A wondering about the role of self-assessment in risk evaluations, especially because for some organizations, they're kind of asking about, some might have members that are really in touch with their risks, and some might have ones that are not so in touch with their risks. And sort of what does that role of self-assessment play here? So I'm curious if you want to speak to that, Maria.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And a couple things I'm thinking is there can be a lot of value in bringing in an independent party to do an enterprise risk assessment for you to help you kind of objectively understand what your risks are. So there is value in that, and it sort of depends on, you know, where your organization is. Is there a lot of sort of agreement in terms of where your biggest risks are, or are you kind of trying to figure out how to prioritize? And then also, you know, one of the things I think is so important when we're thinking about assessing risks is bringing in our entire leadership team and even staff and board voices to compile that information. So even if you are doing it internally, how do you make sure that you're bringing in all of those voices and the insights from all those different parties and aggregating it together to understand your risk? So it's not just, you know, one person identifying those risks. It's not just the, you know, risk management person kind of saying, these are what the risks are. You're really bringing in all those different voices. Okay, so looking at this poll, let's see what we have here. A lot of folks saying all of the above, which is great. All of these tools I think are really, really helpful for organizations in different ways. So I'm glad to see that. Definitely feel free to reach out to us at any point if you want to talk more about any of these tools. And I'm also excited to see that about 20% of you are already using tools like this. I'm hoping that these tools are really helping you manage risk in your organization and that you're learning things from this presentation to maybe continuously evolve your processes throughout. And I'm going to pass it over to Annie Rose to talk about risk appetite.
Fantastic. So risk appetite, I mentioned this earlier, this has come up in a couple different ways so far, but this is essentially a way of thinking about how much risk are we willing to take on as an organization? How much risk are we willing to kind of tolerate as we pursue the goals that we have as an organization? And this varies widely. There is no single risk appetite that we say, this is the risk appetite a foundation should have. This is going to be very much based on your own operations. And what's interesting is that it can vary, between organizations very frequently, but it also can vary within an organization depending on the area of operations. So the example that we have on this slide here is that you might have a really high risk appetite when it comes to your programmatic work. So we can take on a lot of risk when it comes to supporting grassroots organizations that may not have a proven track record of success. So we know that there's going to be risk there, and it's part of our mission to say, because it's so important for us to be supporting this type of organization, we are willing to trade out some of the certainty that we might get from supporting a different type of organization. Versus that same organization might have a really, really low risk appetite when it comes to financial reporting, saying we are not going to take any risks in this area. We're going to put a lot of time and resource and effort toward making sure that we've mitigated every single thing we possibly can in relation to our financial operations. So that's just one example of where risk and how much we are willing to tolerate could look very different across an organization. And that's one of the things that make risk management, I think, really interesting, is because we want to be really clear about what is the bar that we are trying to meet in any given area, knowing that it can be very different. There's also lots of different things that can impact your risk appetite as an organization. So as I mentioned before, the strategy of your organization may come into play here. For example, we had an organization we were working with that had a really aggressive growth strategy. They were trying to expand pretty dramatically, and that led to a significantly higher risk appetite for them. They were willing to take on more. Liability exposure. If you, for example, in your funding model, if you are something like a fiscal sponsorship organization, if you are providing that model, that you're assuming financial and legal liability on behalf of sponsored projects, that might mean you have a more cautious risk appetite in that area because the higher potential liabilities might warrant that. Your leadership and your culture, I would say this is probably the biggest one that is especially sometimes disconnected from the other operating environment that you're working within. But if you have a leader who is either incredibly risk tolerant or incredibly risk averse, that can really filter through the rest of the organization itself. So figuring out, what will that cultural aspect look like for us? And this can look really interesting too if you have two leaders that have very different risk approaches, and that can be kind of an underlying area of tension if it can't be exposed and talked about in really explicit ways as well, to say, okay, this is actually where we're coming into conflict and how can we find resolution here. The financial health of the organization cannot be overlooked on this list. I think it is no surprise to anyone that the stronger your financial position, the more risk you can take on in many ways, because it just gives you more of a buffer. But what's really interesting to me is in our actual work, a lot of times we see this the opposite way. Organizations that have more funds and more resources become more cautious over time as they are making sure that those resources are used as effectively as possible, versus sometimes organizations with less resources are willing to take more risks as well. They're really hitting it out of the park to say, what can we take on? What is the impact that we can have here? So definitely something interesting to consider there. Regulatory and compliance requirements. If you have legal obligations, if you need to ensure compliance with things like tax laws, as we all do, that can often push foundations into a more conservative risk stance, because we want to make sure that we are going to meet all of those compliance needs. And then finally, your stakeholder expectations. What do your most important people expect to see from you? The preferences and risk tolerance of those key stakeholders, whether that's donors, your investors, your board members, family members within private foundations, that all shapes how much risk an organization is willing to take on as well, and how much risk you're expected to take on by your stakeholders. So lots of different things can really impact how much risk you might be willing to tolerate over time. When we're working with organizations that are trying to figure out what their risk tolerance is, we usually walk them through a process where we really start with, what are your organizational goals? What is the key strategies behind what you are trying to do? What are you hoping to accomplish? Because that often it will be the bedrock beneath all the rest of these conversations around risk tolerance. Then we want to think about your financial capacity, your financial resilience, looking at your ability to absorb losses or setbacks, for example, that directly impacts how much risk you can take on. Analyzing your historic risk tolerance. So really thinking about what have we done in the past? What has this looked like? What is the cultural aspects that we're going to be coming into work in the rest of this assessment here? And then your leadership and stakeholders. We really need to understand, where are your leaders, where are your stakeholders in relation to risk tolerance? How are they thinking about this? How are they conceptualizing risk? And then ideally, you want to bring all of these pieces together and create a risk appetite statement. So you're formalizing the findings into a clear statement that outlines what are our acceptable risk levels across different areas within our organization, across financial, operational, reputational. And the purpose of a risk appetite statement is not to create a singular policy that's going to detail every single potential outcome or any of those things, but instead to set a high-level guiding document that can help inform future decisions, and something that your leadership team can be coming back to say, okay, this is what we decided as a group is our risk appetite statement. Does this particular decision align with that? Yes or no? And this is definitely more of an art than a science, but just the process of creating that risk appetite statement can be a huge benefit to, again, making some of the implicit assumptions much more explicit as part of your leadership team. So this is an example of a risk appetite statement. As a foundation, we enable innovative and impactful projects while prioritizing careful management of legal, financial, and reputational risks. So in this instance, this organization had a low tolerance for risks related to legal compliance, financial mismanagement, and reputational harm. They were very focused on ensuring compliance around regulatory requirements, financial oversight, and protection of their public image. In contrast, they said that they're open to higher risks in programmatic activities that push boundaries on social change, as long as thorough due diligence is conducted. So our risk appetite is moderate to high, meaning that they are willing to take on a certain level of risk to enable projects that are aligned with their mission, as long as they know that those risks are, proactively identified. So I think that there's a couple really interesting pieces here where they're calling out that they have a divergence in risk appetite between two different areas within the organization. They wanted to make that very clear. They also wanted to make it clear that on the programmatic side, what they want to do on the risks there are at least identify them. We don't have to mitigate them. We don't have to solve for them. We need to know that they exist. And so that was where a lot of their risk management practices came in on the programmatic side, was to say, we don't expect to be able to reduce risks here. We know that that is an inherent part of our mission, but we want to at least know that we know what we know on this front, so that when issues come up, we can make sure that we had that proactive knowledge that those things may present themselves. So just one example, and as you can see, this isn't going into huge details that would guide the specifics of how every decision is made, but instead it's a way of getting the leadership team on the same page around risk management. So we wanted to get to our fourth polling question here, and I am very curious to hear from this group. Again, and if you had to categorize your organization's risk appetite overall, where would you land on this high, moderate to low? And knowing that, again, we've simplified this quite a bit, we recognize that you may be high in some areas, moderate in others, but I'm really curious to hear from the full group here, sort of where your organization might be sitting. I'm curious, Maria, when you, with the foundations that you work with, where do you feel like they are most commonly falling out on this spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And I feel like that risk appetite statement that you shared is so relevant to so many of the organizations that we're working with, where there's a lot more risk tolerance around our programmatic risks, right? We want to be sort of pushing the envelope of change. We want to really be supporting grassroots organizations who are really trying to make a difference in society in whatever area their mission is in. But more wary of risks around things like grant management. How are we managing funds? How are our grantees managing funds? How are we making sure we're compliant? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like we've got a lot of folks in that moderate category, which makes a ton of sense. We have some in that low and just a few in the high risk category, which I think absolutely tracks for foundations in general. We don't see a lot that are in that higher risk area, but I love seeing that almost 14% of you are in that space, because I think that there's a lot that can also be learned within the foundation industry from each other about how are we thinking about risks, what are we tolerating, what is acceptable in these different areas. So thank you so much for sharing that. So in our last 10 minutes here, I hope we'll have a little bit of time for questions, but I did want to talk about integrating risk management practices into your work and what that can look like. Because I think that there's a couple different factors that really play an oversized role in how much risk management practice you are enabled to integrate into your operations. So what is the size of your organization? If you are a super small organization, you're going to require simplified processes. So for that, this might look like having informal risk discussions with your board and senior management team on a biannual basis. That might be everything that you have capacity to do, but at least you're having the conversation to say, what are the risks that are coming up? What can we identify? What can we talk about? So that it's something that is thought of and part of your leadership culture. In a large organization that has a much more robust approach or more resources available, that might look like formal risk assessments done on an annual basis, documented policies and procedures about these different things, regular internal or performance audits of specific areas. So you can see how there is quite a lot of flexibility in sort of how many of these tools might come into play. And then the size and the availability of resources are often go hand in hand as well, but really thinking about what staff, what budget, what technology resources do we have to implement risk management strategies effectively? Because these things can take a significant amount of effort, and it is better to just do what you actually have the resources to do rather than trying to overextend the organization in this area, which can become a risk in and of itself. We know that programmatically, your mission, your vision, those are the things that you need to be focusing on, and risk needs to be supporting those efforts as you go. So when it comes to things like tools, I think Maria mentioned earlier, smaller teams might just use a basic spreadsheet where you are tracking the risks. That is your risk register, and you're using that as the basis for those regular leadership conversations. Larger organizations may invest in specialized risk management software. You might have a risk officer, a specific dedicated staff that are really supporting these areas. So again, that's going to look really different, and what you're able to do is going to look different depending on the resources that are available. And finally, thinking about your goals and your objectives. What is your organization's mission? You want to be focusing on risks that have the most impact or potential impact on your ability to achieve that mission. And so that can really help you prioritize. If you say, we don't have the resources to do everything we'd want to do in relation to risk management, start with your mission, conduct a brainstorming session with your leadership team to understand which of these risks are most critical so that we can tailor any of our risk management activities to focus on those areas. So I think that that's another really helpful way of bringing your mission front and foremost, is saying, how can that help ensure that we are using our risk management resources as effectively as possible? And then I want to leave with a few closing thoughts here on good key practices that we have seen. The first one here is aligning risk management with your mission and values. So I've already spoken to that, but really thinking about the fact that the risk management framework must be aligned with your organization's mission, the priorities that you have, both in order for it to be effective in doing its job, but also so that you can see that really clear connection between why are we doing risk management to begin with. This should not just be a bureaucratic process. This should be something that is supporting your critical work. Maria talked about fostering a risk-aware culture and the importance of that. I think that's huge. Having training and education, providing training to staff, providing training to your board about what is the board's role in risk management. Those things can be really beneficial, especially if you're in the early stages of setting up this work, and making sure that you have that stakeholder engagement throughout this process, because as we've been speaking to, every member of your organization has a slightly different piece of the risk management puzzle. And so being able to hear from folks across the organization can be very helpful for that. Monitoring and evaluating your risk continuously. That's why the risk-aware culture is so critical, because it's going to help you do that. And so having folks who are trained in that space, that's going to be huge. But then also thinking about what is the cadence that we have capacity to support? Do we have capacity to have a quarterly conversation about risk? Do we have capacity to have an annual risk assessment and update? What is possible for us, but thinking about how can we make sure that that's built in so that we have structures to support this on an ongoing basis. And engaging your leadership and your governance team is going to be a huge part of that as well, because if you do not have those folks on board with this work, it will absolutely not be effective. So having a risk champion within your leadership team can be huge to make sure that you have that leadership commitment, that people are coming along in this work, and that especially for your board of directors, making sure that they understand their oversight role in risk management. So much of what the board does in its essential purpose is related to risk management, but sometimes we don't conceptualize it in that way. So making sure that they are engaged here too. And then finally, when in doubt, when all things seem incredibly uncertain, how can we be really relying on those contingency plans that Maria mentioned earlier? So with that, I know that there are some really fantastic questions that came in through the chat. Thank you so much to everyone who is able to post there. For those of you who we weren't able to follow up with directly, we will make sure to do that after this webcast as well. So you will be hearing from us, because there's some really, really great pieces that I'm sorry we aren't able to get to today. But with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Danielle to close us out today.
Fantastic. Thank you both for a great presentation today. To our audience, as Annie Rose just mentioned, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us, as we would be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to the presenters directly. Their contact information is in your console, as well as in the slide deck, which you can download now from the handouts window. If you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE Progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks as well. And finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated. Again, thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone.